They were the most beautiful women in the empire, and that beauty condemned them. A scroll unrolled on the polished table. A scribe cleared his throat and read the list aloud. Province, father's name, age, distinguishing marks. When he reached one name, a hand reached from the shadows and struck through the ink. The girl beside him was led away. They took her apart the way a tailor measured fabric. The length of a limb, the breadth of a shoulder, the exact color of an eye. Not to welcome her, but to catalog her. Not to honor her, but to possess her. This was not simply capture, it was a system. Within the great palaces, hidden from the forums and tribunals, practiced behind gilt doors and perfumed curtains, women were turned into objects of imperial use. Their names were federal papers struck from ledgers. Their faces were recorded in bronze and marble to be remade for display. Their bodies were arranged and controlled as instruments of politics. Many of the cruelties were quiet. Many left no official inscription. They took place in rooms where even gossip was a punishable offense. Content warning: the following material discusses sexual exploitation, bodily violence, and punitive mutilation in a historical context. It will describe acts of control and punishment without graphic detail. If you like dark history told with detail, subscribe to Forgotten Stories: Ancient World. They began with selection. Young women arrived from provinces across the empire, from port cities and rural villas, from mountain hamlets and caravan towns. Some were taken from families who believed honor or favor awaited them within imperial walls. Some were summoned under the guise of service or marriage. The reasons recorded were deceptively routine. Daughters presented for education, chosen for domestic skill, or recommended for beauty. But within the palace system, recommendation was only the first step toward erasure. Names were the first casualties. In ordinary life, a name connected an individual to kin, to memory, to legal standing. In palace practice, that connection was severed. Registers that once recorded lineage were edited. Census fragments later recovered by archaeologists show pages with ink blotted out, with margins rewritten in hasty script. Where a father's name should have stood, a blank remained. In some dramatic accounts, officials painted over inscriptions on family tombs, and recarved reliefs to replace a daughter's face with a profile more politically convenient. Whether these acts were ordered by an emperor or carried out by subordinates on rumor and impulse is often unclear. Historians call many of these practices alleged or rumored within the courts. Once chosen, the girl underwent a ritual of transformation. It began with being renamed, a new appellation that meant possession. Tutors and matrons instructed her how to move through the palace. She learned not only to curtsy at the right time, but to lower her voice until it was nearly silent. Speech itself became dangerous. In the quieter wings, a slip of the tongue could earn a punitive report. Tutors kept ledgers on comportment. Scribes recorded infractions. Silence was taught as survival and as obedience. The quiet wing was both a sanctuary and a prison. Marble halls gleamed with lacquer and oil lamps that burned through the night. Perfume threads the air, rosewater and cedar, jasmine tucked into curtains. Musicians played at distant hours, so the wings would feel awake without the need for conversation. Cushions were stacked, silk draped through latticed windows. On the surface, it resembled paradise. Underneath, it was a system of surveillance. Women learned to speak with their eyes. A tilt of a head, a finger under a hem, the placement of a curtsy. All became a code. Tutors taught gestures and punished deviation. The most grievous offenses were not only those of speech, but of memory. Remembering one's family, speaking of a hometown, recounting a father's name, These acts were suspect because they implied a self not fully surrendered to the house. In some accounts, women would whisper names into the palm of a companion only to have that companion report them. Loyalty within the palace could be coerced and purchased. Betrayal lurked as a currency. Reproductive control formed the heart of the palace's calculus. Children born within the household could become heirs or instruments of alliance. A son born to a favored woman raised her status and the prestige of the household. A miscarriage could be interpreted as a private failure with public consequences. There are accounts, some written by later physicians and chroniclers, others preserved in ambiguous records, that suggest miscarriage or stillbirth could be met with punitive measures. In the most chilling portrayals, women who lost pregnancies were shamed, isolated, or sent into exile. In other times, the loss of a child was treated as an ill omen, a thing whispered about in corridors and used against mothers during political purges. The palace engineered appearances of benevolence when it served power. Lavish banquets, gardens, and ornate baths kept the household on display. Yet these spectacles were double-edged. Banquets themselves sometimes functioned as tests. Women placed in certain positions at table watched, catalogued. A rumor, carried in diaries and later histories, told of a feast where 50 women sat expecting to be honored, and when morning came, 50 beds were cold or empty. Some were recorded as having left the household under strange circumstances. Others were quietly moved to places from which no return was expected. Whether these removals were deaths, exiles, or ceremonial expulsions is often unclear. Records obfuscated motive and method. Rituals of punishment and of symbolism were part of the architecture of control. Several evocative objects recur in the records and in archaeological suggestion: a bronze mask, a chamber of reflections, veils woven with specific colors, a black ledger where names were blotted out. The bronze mask was said to be used in disciplinary ceremony, a fearsome mouthpiece of cold metal that signaled the removal of speech and, with it, of public presence. Accounts of sewn mouths, of tongues taken, exist in some sources as anecdote or allegory. Historians mark such descriptions as possible or allegorical when evidence is not conclusive. The image of sewn lips functions as a powerful metaphor for silencing, even where the precise method remains uncertain. In one vignette passed down in fragmentary records, a woman of provincial origin had been accused of speaking improperly to a visiting dignitary. She was taken to a room called the Chamber of Reflections, its walls mirrored to amplify solitude. There, a matron instructed her to remove her garments and to lay out the items that constituted her previous life: a ring, a ribbon, a scrap of a weaving she once made for her brother. The matron then took each item and, in a gesture meant to mark both possession and burial, placed them into a chest that was then locked. The woman's name, too, was read from a scroll and pronounced obsolete. Whether a mask was used, whether the mouth was physically altered, whether the act was performed in the extreme ways later told, those details vary across accounts. Still, the ritual's effect was consistent. The woman's former life was summarily archived and put away. The politics of visibility did not stop with the living. Memory in stone and ink was remade. Statues were reworked. Portrait reliefs were recarved. A Laris's inscription could be sanded down and re-engraved to erase her lineage. A family altar might be rearranged so that a once-remembered daughter no longer figured in ancestral rites. Historians describe a sort of administrative killing, not of body necessarily, but of social life and legal recognition. To be erased from records was to be made invisible to law, to kinship, to history. Some practices left material traces that later archaeologists have unearthed and interpreted. Plaster handprints were found in a site thought to be near a palatial wing. Scratched into the wet surface, a single word appears in some impressions: "I remembered." Bronze discs, small stamps of metal, have been discovered in storage rooms and at the bases of statues, their purpose debated. In a sealed tomb, archaeologists once uncovered dozens of silk-wrapped bodies, placed with care rather than hastily buried, suggesting a burial away from public knowledge. None of these finds deliver unambiguous verdicts. They are fragments that point towards practices of concealment, of ritual closure, of lives managed on a scale the public could not always see. We must be careful with language here. The physical evidence suggests patterns and possibilities, not universal laws. Where records are silent, rumor proliferated. Chroniclers wrote what they could know or imagine. Later physicians recorded cases with moralizing notes. Archaeologists interpret fragments with caution, suggesting that a bronze tag might have functioned as a marker for inventory rather than as a literal gag. Yet the pattern is telling. Across different palaces and decades, the same themes recur: selection, renaming, surveillance, reproductive calculation, punitive silence. Silence operated as both punishment and as preservation. In some cases, women who could not be killed or expelled were instead sequestered in a quiet wing where their daily needs were met but their social presence was removed. They were fed, clothed, and housed, physically comfortable in the material sense, but they were excised from a public and familial narrative. Their existences were a kind of living death, visible to the household insiders who needed them, invisible to the world that once sustained them. Survivors later described this condition as worse than any single violent act. To be kept, to be safe from naked danger, yet to be deliberately erased from legal, civic, and memorial life. That was a punishment that lasted beyond the body. The question of reproductive politics requires particular attention. In a society where lineage, inheritance, and succession mattered supremely, the womb became a matter of policy. A child born to the household could shift alliances and unlock influence. A failed pregnancy could lead to suspicion and disgrace. Some women found ways to wield their reproductive capacity as a form of agency, to secure protection by carrying a favored child, to bargain for safety through patronage networks among other women. Others became expendable when their bodies failed to yield what's desired. The balance of power was cruelly mathematical. A child was not only the hope of a mother, but also a ledger entry in the calculus of the palace. There were objects and symbols that encoded this calculus. Golden threads were woven into tunics to indicate favor. Veils of a certain hue signaled dismissal or relocation. A ledger, sometimes called in later accounts the Black Book of Erasure, recorded removals in a bureaucratic hand. Names crossed, rights cancelled, allowances cut. It is unclear whether such a black book was a single centralized instrument or a metaphor for a wider administrative practice. But the phrase captures how the household system could reduce a person to a line item. At times, the empire's appetite for spectacle collided with secrecy. A banquet might become a theater of judgment. Women dressed in finery, seated to show wealth and command, while the emperor and his household watched for cues. For a favored curve of attention, for a child's gesture. The morning after certain feasts, records sometimes note absences. Did those absences mark death, exile, deliberate disappearance into private tombs? We cannot always know. Where inquiry reached too close to power, the archives often fell silent or were edited. Memory itself was curated. In the quieter corners of the palace, there were instances of resistance, small, human interruptions in a system designed to silence. Women left coded messages stitched into hems, with patterns that only trusted companions could read. A mitt could carry a tiny knot with information about a brother or a lover. A particular way of folding a napkin could signal readiness to run. These methods were not grand rebellions. They were acts of remembrance. They kept a name alive in a secret vocabulary. When archaeologists later discovered a hem with cramped, deliberate stitching that formed letters rather than decoration, they could sometimes decode a fragment of resistance, an assertion, "I was here." The end of some women's stories took place in quiet graves or in sealed rooms. Archaeologists studying burial sites near known palaces have found clusters of internments with signs of deliberate concealment. Bodies wrapped in fine textiles, placed without overt markers, tucked away in chambers that would not receive public rites. An old physician's note mentioned a sealed room where women were kept until their natural end, then buried without fanfare. That note reads as rumor and should be treated cautiously. Yet when material culture and later writings align, they suggest that removal from public memorial life was practiced in ways both formal and informal. The moral question at the center of all this is ancient and urgent. Which is worse, death or being erased? To die can be to exit memory immediately, but it also releases the story to be told by others, to be mourned and to be marked. To be erased while alive is to experience a social death. Family ties severed, legal rights withdrawn, names stripped from records, rights refused. Some survivors described the latter as punishment more terrible than the sword. How could a person navigate a world that refused to recognize her existence? Consider the metaphor of the mask. A bronze mask used in a ritual or discipline does more than prevent speech. It asserts that language, memory, and testimony are now the property of another. It symbolizes a transfer. The woman's story is no longer hers to tell. The same idea applied to carved reliefs and recarved faces. When the public portrait of a person is altered, the historical record itself is intervened upon. Memory becomes a tool to be wielded by power. Yet there were also traces that refused erasure. Plaster handprints with the scratched word "I remembered" testify to an insistence on selfhood. A written note sewn into a hem, left in a child's toy, a whispered name passed down to a niece, these fragments resist the official silence. Archaeology often finds rebellion in small things. A personal pendant hidden beneath a floorboard, a scrap of hair wrapped in a private cloth. These objects do not overturn the system, but they preserve individual identities against bureaucratic amnesia. We must be careful not to overstate cause and effect. Not every blank in a record meant a violent erasure. Not every missing statue denoted sinister intent. Many acts we interpret as calculated erasure likely took place within tangled motives: jealousy, political maneuvering, the mere human cruelty that flourishes where accountability is absent. The historian's task is to weigh evidence, to read patterns, and to acknowledge uncertainty. When a source is thin, the right practice is to qualify. This was rumored, this seems possible, this is suggested by archaeological context. Even so, the cumulative picture is bleak. A system that could comfortably feed and clothe someone while declaring her non-existent in law and ritual inflicted a particular cruelty. Consider the legal and social consequences. If a woman's name was struck from registers, she could lose succession rights, inheritance claims, the capacity to be litigant or witness. People depend on being named. Contracts, property, marriage alliances, these presuppose recognition. The palace's ability to strip recognition was a sovereign violence. We return finally to that irrevocable question: what is worse than death? The title that brought you here insists that the intimate cruelties practiced in imperial households can be worse than a simple mortal end. It offers a moral provocation. The destruction of personhood through systematic erasure inflicted a lifelong injury that outlived many violent deaths. Those who were kept, cataloged, and made into instruments lived in a state that historians of memory call social death. They endured existence without memorialization. History favors the memorable: rulers, generals, senators, and victories. But the hidden ones, the concubines, the sequestered women, the names blotted out of ledgers, challenge us to rethink whose stories count. The archaeological fragments and fragmented records that survive signal not just crimes of bodies, but crimes against memory. The bronze discs, the plaster handprints, the silk-wrapped aerials, these are a ledger of resistances and losses. They whisper of lives that were deliberately marginalized, then partially reclaimed by sediment and patient excavation. Why does this matter now? Because memory builds justice. When we can name and tell lives, we grant them a form of afterlife that can lead to truth. When power declares certain lives unworthy of memory, it not only punishes the living, but robs future generations of a full account of the past. The moral cost is cumulative. The empire's splendor is partly measured in what it made invisible. So, we leave you with the question embedded in the title and sharpened by these vignettes. What did emperors do to these young maidens that could be considered worse than death? Was it the removal of their names, the stripping of their civic and family ties, the silence forced upon them, or the conversion of their bodies into instruments of statecraft? The answer may be different for each woman. For some, exile or execution ended their pain quickly. For others, the punishment of being kept, seen but not acknowledged, was a slow unraveling of personhood that outlived them in ways worse than any single violent act. If you think about it, history is built from decisions about who is allowed to be remembered. The empire invested vast resources in spectacle and monument, but it also invested in erasures. The bronze mask and the black book are two sides of the same coin. One silenced the body, the other the memory. Between them, they forged a method of control that turned individuals into placeholders, useful until they were not. Which then is worse, being erased or being remembered only as an instrument? Perhaps both are tragedies. Perhaps the true cruelty is that a person could be both beautiful and invisible, adorned yet unnameable. The lasting injustice is that many could not even leave a carved trace for later generations to debate. Tell us what you think. Which is worse, being erased or being remembered? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this kind of dark, careful history interests you, consider subscribing to Forgotten Stories: Ancient World for more.